Hi everyone, and welcome back to Lemon Dew. I'm Brie, and in today's episode, I'm actually going to change the topic that I'm going to be covering. So originally, I had planned to cover autism representation in media. However, that is going to be the next episode because I wanted to talk about Labour's decision to make cuts on disability benefits. Now, after finding out about the Labour government's potential decision to reduce disability benefits, I thought that now was a good time to talk about my opinion on what they intend to do, as well as the concerns I have for disabled people who live in the UK that rely on disability benefits in order to try to maintain some form of equality of life. So without further ado, let's begin. Now, just a quick note here, I may be covering some sensitive topics in relation to mental health as well as suicides, as of course I am going to be discussing this in terms of the effects that reducing benefits can have for disabled people. I am also going to be sharing an experience, not one that is by myself. Sorry if I'm making any sense. What I'm trying to say is I am going to be sharing an experience of a family member, more specifically my aunt, who does receive benefits due to depression after a tragic incident. So I am going to be covering a little bit of sensitive stuff. So I just wanted to put that in so you guys are aware. So now we can begin. So, as of recently, I first found out about Labour's disability benefit cuts via The Canary. And if you don't know what The Canary is, this is an independent news source which reports on political topics in an unbiased manner. This is actually the only news source that I receive news from because I do find that a lot of mainstream news sources tend to report news in a twisted way, more so by omitting facts and putting in mostly negative content in order to garner hostile reactions from the general public. Now, before I talk about the concerns regarding how these benefit cuts affect the disabled, I'm just going to give a quick summary of what disability benefits exist in the UK. So the current disability benefit that exists at the moment is called PIP, and this is an acronym for Personal Independence Payment. So this benefit applies to individuals who are under the state pension age that have long-term disabilities or illnesses. This is a full weekly payment which the government gives, and it's tax-free and worth £9,500 a year. Unlike certain benefits such as universal credit, PIP is not means tested. So to be more specific, what I mean by this is that PIP is not assessed based on income or capital you have, which can include any investments or any items that can be worth a certain amount of value, savings, etc. So regardless of whether you have an income or not, you can qualify for PIP if you do have a long-term disability or illness which affects your ability to live your daily life. Now, there are two parts to PIP. So the first part is the daily living component, and this applies for tasks like eating and getting dressed, for example. There is also a second component, which is mobility. So this mostly applies if you have difficulties getting around your area without assistance. Now, individuals with long-term disabilities or illnesses can qualify for either one or both components. However, this depends on how your disability or illness affects you. Now, the benefit assessment is normally carried out by the DWP, and there are a few factors taken into consideration, which include whether you can do a task safely, how long it takes you to complete, how the condition affects your activity, and whether extra help is required via an extra person, such as a carer or any specialist equipment. Now, besides the Labour government's decision on cutting disability benefits, they've also decided to implement schemes which help disabled people get back into work. Now, of course, as you already know, I am a woman with autism, and autism is classed as a hidden disability which is covered under the Equality Act of 2010. Now, despite being autistic, I am in employment. So as of now, I currently work in a full-time job as a receptionist for a local council, which is 36 hours a week. However, I am one in a small percentage of autistic or, I guess, disabled individuals that are lucky enough to be in employment, let alone consistent employment. Now, don't get me wrong, I am all for the idea of helping disabled people get into work, but my main concern is what plan the Labour government has in place for the long term, as well as whether their plan will actually help the disabled. Now, one thing I've noticed regarding government-initiated work-based schemes is that they have proved to be ineffective, because not only are the real issues concerning unemployment are not looked at enough, there are also cases where claimants as a whole get taken advantage of, or in other words, exploited by employers. So using the Kickstart scheme as an example, despite not being in the same context as what I'm discussing, this scheme was meant to help 18 to 24-year-olds get back into long-term employment, as during the pandemic, they were one in a huge group that were affected by the lack of jobs available. Now, instead of employers offering long-term opportunities that could give employees real work experience that they could put on their CV, most employers use the scheme for cheap labour, especially because costs for Kickstarters were practically subsidised by the government. Now, employees under this scheme, myself included, because my previous job was a Kickstart scheme job at the time, were paid minimum wage for a part-time job, which was 25 hours a week. And as you already know, given the cost of living, a minimum wage job is hard to manage when you have rent, bills, council tax, and other necessities to pay for without going into overdraft. Now, of course, most employees did have horrible experiences with their Kickstart jobs. So you had cases where employees were partaking in dodgy practices, not being paid on time, not having pension contributions paid on time, either not having enough work or too much work above their pay grade. And there were even cases where employees under the scheme didn't even receive training. So looking at my previous job as an example, as it was a Kickstart job before I became a permanent admin assistant, I didn't really get enough training, so everything I did was pretty much trial and error. And if you're being placed in a job where you are new, it takes 6 to 12 months to be competent enough. And you do need assistance so that you don't screw up, especially because certain mistakes could factor in an entire company potentially imploding, so to say. Now, when it comes to the government and their work-based schemes, it's not really about helping people find jobs which are meaningful. It's about filling quotas and ticking boxes. And the same thing applies to the DWP, especially where work coaches are concerned, as the majority just tend to shove you into any old job just so you come off their caseload. Now, of course, being a work coach isn't easy, especially because you may have more than 100 caseloads to deal with at a time. So there's limited amount of time for each claimant, and then you might have upper management pressurizing you to meet targets. And if you don't meet targets, you don't really get many benefits. And depending on your manager, you may lose your job if you don't adhere to these requirements. Now, in terms of the current system, at least when it comes to claiming disability benefits, it's very difficult for the disabled to navigate. Now, what doesn't help is that in the UK, we still have a classist mentality. So if you are somebody who is working class and is working or getting universal credit at the same time, that is if your job is less than 16 hours a week, or you're on universal credit or any other benefit in general, you're automatically classed as a scrounger, someone who is a layabout or a parasite that just takes money from the state when they feel like it. Now, don't get me wrong, you unfortunately have people who do take the piss with the benefit system, but for those that genuinely need assistance, they are often categorized in the same box as those who unfortunately take advantage in an unlawful manner. And what doesn't help is that the mainstream media they create this image that makes a bit more sense of benefit claimants thinking that all of them are the same, when really you do have benefit claimants who struggle to make ends meet and have genuine issues. Now, of course, what doesn't help is disabled people have to deal with the stress and agony of even trying to qualify for PIP. So you have endless assessments, reassessments, and even appeals if your claim gets rejected. And this causes mental health especially to deteriorate. Now, if this benefit gets removed or even cut, disabled people would not only be pushed further into poverty, they would be financially destitute and in some cases would consider suicide, because if you can't have a quality of life that is good enough, then there's no point in even trying to live. Now, lots of people in general, regardless of whether they're disabled or not, have addressed issues concerning financial management because of the high cost of living due to inflation. Prices for basic necessities, even food or childcare, and this is besides rent, bills or council tax, for example, increase year after year. But in many industries, wages often remain stagnant, and considering how the minimum wage as of now is barely over £12 an hour, if you do a 40-hour-a-week job and you're on minimum wage, the most you would get before tax is maybe just over 24,000, which really is not enough to live on, especially if you live in cities like London. Now, some people who do receive PIP are already near in poverty, and this benefit is the bare minimum required for a disabled person to try to have some kind of life. Now, I am going to share an example here in regards to somebody who does suffer from a long-term illness. So I have an aunt who is actually getting some form of benefit because of depression, as unfortunately my cousin was stabbed nearly 4 years ago, and since then she has been unable to work as of December 2021. Now, when it comes to my aunt's condition, she keeps having to reiterate to professionals how she's affected. And due to depression, she cannot complete basic tasks, she cannot remember things, hence why she needs paper to write things down all the time. And she even has physical injuries to contend to with her legs and feet, one of which was caused in her workplace when she was attacked by a patient, considering that she used to work in a care home. She pretty much requires assistance in terms of finances, as well as support from myself and my mum when it comes to dealing with basic tasks, even though we both work. So for example, where her finances are concerned, my mum has to deal with her paperwork, and if my aunt needs to use the computer to write emails, I have to type them because she is unable to use a computer properly. Now, by taking these kinds of benefits away from a person like her, her struggles would worsen, and as mentioned, physical and mental health would deteriorate. So can you imagine being in a situation like that, knowing your benefits are gone and there is little you can do, yeah, I couldn't imagine that myself. So going back to the overall topic, the needs that would be considered as no longer eligible for PIP would include assistance in terms of cutting up food, supervision or prompting to be able to wash or bathe, assistance to wash your hair or body below the waist, assistance when getting in or out of a bath or shower, supervision or prompting to be able to manage needs when going to the toilet, assistance for dressing or undressing, and supervision, prompting, or assistance to be able to manage medications and monitor health conditions. Now, the needs listed are basic fundamentals every individual requires in order to live a good quality of life. And in a recent article from an independent news source, The Canary, which is the same news source I referred to earlier, Richard Burgon, who is currently an MP for Leeds East, asked Stephen Timms, who is the current Minister of State on Social Security and Disability, tough questions on the Labour government's decision to cut disability benefits. When asked about plans for disability benefit reforms, Tim's response was as follows, and I quote, "A high number of people get PIP by having multiple but low-level functional needs across several activities. These could individually be managed with small interventions or the addition of aids or appliances. The change will focus PIP more on those with the greatest needs, ensuring those who are unable to complete activities at all or who require more help from others to complete them still get support." So, according to the Labour government, the above listed would be considered as low-level functional needs. So in other words, if you require assistance on a day-to-day basis, you really shouldn't be entitled to disability benefits. Now, Timms also mentioned that those who have these low-level needs would be given small interventions or appliances in order to manage coping with daily tasks. But what appliances are even going to be given to aid these individuals, and how would these constant interventions work? We don't know because, of course, the government are just saying things without actually delivering. Now, in the case of actually getting disabled people into work, this is, of course, easier said than done. Now, considering that I used to do recruitment in my previous job, I have gained a bit more knowledge in terms of the processes employers use when it comes to hiring candidates. And I've even advertised jobs before and used applicant tracking systems, which of course have given me additional knowledge in those areas. Now, as much as I don't like being overly harsh in this case, unfortunately, I do have to be honest and state that most employers will simply not hire disabled candidates for a job. If a disability is revealed in an application form, most employers will immediately think about how much reasonable accommodations will cost if the employee requires them. So using autism as an example and my previous job as an example, as those are areas I have experience in, let's say in theory an autistic employee worked in an open plan office and required a cubicle for better concentration due to the amount of noise or sensory overload in the office. If the cost to build a cubicle is too high, employers can refuse the adjustment, and in this case they probably would because open plan settings are cheaper to maintain. So instead of having individual cubicles for staff, you would just have desks and also hot desking, which is where you sit on a random desk and have a random setup pretty much every day. Now, the hot desking doesn't apply to my job because since I'm a receptionist, I'm in a fixed area in a fixed desk. But the point is, for autistic employees who have to work in this kind of setting, constant changes of desks can prove to be unsettling, especially because you don't know where to put anything, you don't really know what's going to happen, and it's just easier to have a consistent setup because you know what to expect. Now, another issue pertaining to getting disabled people into work is, of course, sickness. So if a disability causes an employee to take time off sick, it's not really good for an employer because it wouldn't make sense for them to pay someone full wages if the individual is not on site. And of course, the employer would have no choice but to get rid of the individual because they would prove to be unreliable. Now, of course, speaking of further issues, the lack of jobs is also another thing I have to talk about. It's already very difficult enough for individuals without disabilities to look for work, considering how different the job market is in 2025. Now, when it comes to jobs, you usually have more than 100 applicants applying for one position. And even as someone who has casually tried to look for admin jobs closer to home, I can honestly tell you that after submitting 25 to 30 applications last year, I've only ever had 2 interviews, and the rest of the applications I sent resulted in either rejections with an email or a rejection without any correspondence, because nowadays employers do not have time to reply to every candidate. Now, one day I actually browsed Indeed and decided to look at what jobs existed in the UK that had vacancies. And unfortunately, most of the jobs that came up included jobs that paid minimum wage or barely above, jobs in industries like warehousing, retail or sales, or office-based jobs like administrative roles or receptionist roles, or even jobs within the education sector or care. The only other jobs which came up besides jobs in those industries were 0-hour jobs in which you're not guaranteed work on a regular basis. And of course, most of these jobs would be near impossible for disabled individuals to do, because if, say, a disabled individual worked in a care home, that would be impossible because you have to be mobile, you have to lift patients using hoists, you have to handle all sorts of equipment, so that is out of the question. The only way in which disabled people could potentially do jobs is if accommodations, as mentioned, were put in place. So if, say, there was an office job advertised and there was a work from home option, that would be beneficial because a disabled candidate wouldn't necessarily need to travel to an office when they have difficulties in doing so. Even application processes can be difficult for disabled candidates to deal with. For a start, most jobs are advertised online because this is a quicker way for employers to review application forms or CVs. So that omits all of the unnecessary paperwork. If you don't know how to use modern tech, then filling in online applications can be a struggle. So if, say, you have application questions that come up which ask you to describe your experience, you may have difficulties trying to articulate yourself if, say, you're dyslexic or autistic, just as an example. And if you don't know how to use modern tech, you either need someone who is tech savvy to fill a form, or you have to go to a job centre to take computer classes. As for the interview process, that is also a struggle because you have difficulties in even answering questions. With interviews, the purpose is to essentially sell yourself so that an employer is more convinced in taking you on for a position. And of course, interview questions can range from anything from questions regarding what kind of job you're looking for, what experience you have, to competency-based questions where you are tested to see how you'd handle potential situations that can come across in the workplace, such as a disagreement with a colleague or a conflict with a customer or a client. Being autistic myself, I actually struggle more with the social side, and I often have to mask so that I can appear confident. I have difficulties articulating myself where competency-based questions like STAR questions are concerned, because if there's an instance where I've never had an experience like dealing with difficult people or colleagues, it's very hard for me to come up with an answer that would impress the employer. Other than that, eye contact is also difficult because when you have a panel of interviewers staring at you, it completely throws you off and you become less confident and feel inadequate. Now, as mentioned, most jobs nowadays have too many applicants going for a single role. Employers don't spend hours reading CVs either, so they simply filter through and they pick maybe their top 3 to 5 candidates for a job. And I know this because I used to use applicant tracking systems in my previous job, and they would filter CVs in a way where ones which had no relevance to the job application would just get tossed in the trash. Now, even keeping a job is very difficult if you have a disability, because if it affects your ability to perform well, your employer would slowly push you out of the role. So employers often have a habit of using terminology when dismissing an employee in order to outright avoid discrimination. So if, say, you have autism and you don't really identify social cues well, your employer can get rid of you and simply say that you are not a good culture fit. And of course, before you even get dismissed, you can be put on a personal improvement plan. Now, if there's a case where employers don't use discriminatory language, you don't really have a case for yourself, because the employer can turn around and say that they never discriminated and they had a valid reason for getting rid of you. Now, of course, there is also the issue of actually disclosing, because this is a grey area. Most employees find that despite being covered under the 2010 Equality Act where disabilities are concerned, they don't disclose because employers can often be ignorant or very dismissive. And of course, if you don't disclose, you don't really have a case for yourself, because again, if the employer doesn't know you have a disability, they can just turn around and say that. Now, there are some exceptions to disclosing. So in my case, my manager and some of my colleagues are aware that I am autistic, and I haven't really been treated poorly because of that. I've just had people sort of ask me what it's like being autistic and how I manage to cope in my job. And I've even used my experiences in a positive way, mostly by delivering talks on autism and also giving advice to colleagues who work with young people that have autism. And as of now, I am actually currently looking into becoming an art therapist or a mentor, because since you don't have enough mental health services in particular for autistic individuals, I would like to try to give autistic people the tools they need to thrive in a neurotypical world. Now, going back to my issues regarding disabled people getting into work, the kind of behaviour mentioned in terms of discrimination and such is unfortunately normal in workplaces. So a lot of workplaces have this kind of dynamic which is similar to a high school setting. So you've got cliques and management teams which encourage toxic behaviour, and this makes workplaces very difficult for disabled people to be in. Instead of education about disabilities, employers tend to ignore them, or they do performative events like Autism Awareness Week or Autism Awareness Month, for example, just to make the company's reputation look better. And don't get me wrong, I think diversity is great, but I really do notice that there are too many instances where diversity is forced. And I really hate that, because it's almost as if people are just trying to prove a point without actually listening to what minority groups need. It's very clear as well that the government are very out of touch with the needs of disabled people. So, of course, as usual, you have a one-size-fits-all approach, and instead of caring about marginalised groups that they claim to help, the government find it easier to just kill these groups off because they are expendable. So, in the case of disabilities, most people would look at you as useless, which is absolutely not true. And the government probably look at disabled people this way, which is why it's just easier to take away the little support they require. Now, of course, I am speaking for people who genuinely need the help, not people who take the piss with the system. And of course, I don't want to judge everybody on benefits, because I've been on benefits before, and I know how it feels to not only feel inadequate, but to feel like a scrounger. And I've even known people who are or have been on benefits before. So that's why I don't want to judge everyone. I just want to try and be more open-minded, so to say. Now, there can be potential solutions when it comes to helping disabled people find work. Not just work, but meaningful work where individuals can actually utilize their experiences and skills to the best of their ability whilst trying to figure out their true potential. Rather than pushing people into low-paid, zero-hour roles with high turnover, as well as lack of progression, you can get specialists who are trained in supporting disabled individuals or even disabled individuals in employment to act as mentors. So having one-to-one sessions where they work closely with disabled individuals to identify skills, experience, knowledge, and strengths and weaknesses would prove a great help. And having someone who has lived a similar experience to yourself would be a bigger help, because you will be able to work with a mentor who fully understands you rather than somebody who just dismisses you and thinks that your disability is not real or that you are just making things up. Even having medical professionals working with the DWP to assess someone's entitlement to PIP could help, because you would have the advice of someone who works in the healthcare industry and has the experience of dealing with people who have various disabilities and illnesses, because having only DWP workers do assessments really doesn't help disabled people, especially because most of the DWP workers will look at a disabled person and say, because you have support, you are able to do XYZ and you are fit for work, even though you might not be. And rather than the simple advertising of disability confident workplaces, employers need to have one-to-one sessions with their employees so they can identify how to accommodate disabilities in the best way possible. So this includes providing specialist software if an individual is working in an office. And of course, employers do require further training on disabilities so they can gain more awareness and understanding. Now, in order for these accommodations to work, employers and employees do need to meet halfway so that there is a 50-50 discussion rather than it being biased. And speaking of training, of course, even having disabled employees contribute to existing training resources is effective, because sometimes if you have non-disabled individuals delivering training, it's not taken as seriously, especially because if you do not understand what it's like to live in a world catered to the majority rather than a minority, then you're not exactly qualified enough to even deliver a training course. And of course, more information on existing resources like access to work needs to be mentioned more. So I never knew what access to work even was until a coaching session last year. And even though I have a little bit more understanding of how it works, I have no idea what I'm entitled to, mainly because I've managed to, support myself in my adult years despite being autistic. And I've more or less had to support myself because support for autistic adults doesn't really exist. Or maybe it does, but there's just not enough resources, because a lot of resources I see are often catered to children. And it's like in the UK, once you turn 18, all your support is cut off. And there you go, you use your wings and go in the world and fly. Now, as mentioned, more information does need to be given where resources are concerned, because that way disabled employees can have access for support. So whether it's access to work, mental health support like therapy with trained professionals, that would make a huge difference. So this is the end of today's episode on Labour's issues and concerns, of course, in relation to disability benefit cuts. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and as always, thank you for supporting me in this podcast, because it really is encouraging to know that there are people who like my content and it helps keep me going. So I will be covering autism representation in media in the next few weeks. And of course, as always, when I release the episode, it will be on a Sunday. Now, considering that is the bank holiday tomorrow, I hope you guys, or girls, whoever you are, enjoy the rest of your weekend and enjoy your bank holiday if you have time off, because having rest and relaxation is very important, as you need that 100%. So this is coming to 35 minutes. I didn't even realise I was talking for so long, so I'll be off. And until next time, enjoy your day. Bye for now.